So I'm going to invite Amy to turn on your camera with your other panelists. So hi, Amy, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you, Rob? What a beautiful poem. It was beautiful.
It was amazing, wasn't it?
Yeah, really good.
It was amazing. And yeah, Kate's got such a wonderful way with words and just, to encapsulate these feelings. It's brilliant. So let's get the rest of your panelists up. We've got Lena, we've got Luciana. Hi, Jane. We've got Jane with hopefully a microphone not echoing. So you're both on mute, actually, when you come up to the stage. So just flick your microphone on.
Okay, cool.
We've got Lena and Victoria is just our final panelist. So let me just double check. No, I'll need to invite Victoria up. So bear with me while I do that. There she is. So Victoria is actually my own therapist, and she normally has a bit of an echoing mic when we do remote therapy. So she is. So look, thank you all for joining us. Fantastic to see you all. Amy, I'm going to get out of the way and allow you to kind of get into this this fantastic discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rob. And thanks everyone for joining me. What we're going to try to do, I'm going to introduce myself and all of these wonderful ladies in a second. But my request, and I'm going to try and facilitate this, is that we make this session as interactive as possible. So please put in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. I'll weave stuff that comes through to the chat into our discussion and also the questions and answers. So everybody kind of listening, let's make this interactive, because one of the fantastic things about the work that Rob and Chris are doing on these virtual conferences is that we can actually have interaction with the panel speaking. So I will try to facilitate that. My name's Amy McKeown. I've been working in and around mental health for about 20 years. I ran a mental health tech startup in my 20s, which was a long time ago now. I guess I'm best known for writing and implementing a UK-wide health and mental health strategy at the Big Four company, Ernst & Young. And I recently, as an independent, just wrote Burberry's global health and mental health strategy that we're about to start implementing. I am joined, and I'm going to go around how I can see them in my screen, with Jane Thomas. Jane and I have been working for about 20 years together. Jane runs a company called Premier Life Skills, which is a mental health and wellbeing company that does a lot of training, but is really well known for their almost degree level diploma in mental health and wellbeing awareness. Jane is also a nurse by background and has worked in intensive care. So we're going to be asking Jane to talk about her experiences and that of her friends and colleagues who are still working on the front line. I've got Lena, who is a clinical psychologist and mental health advisor based in Norway, who's engaged in a broad spectrum of health-related issues and contexts. She's passionate about promoting mental health, well-being, socio-emotional skills, empowerment, sustainable leadership in both traditional and e-health settings. I've got Victoria, who is a registered psychologist and trauma specialist, and Rob's therapist as well. And Victoria was almost killed in a cycling accident a few years ago, and was quite ill, very ill afterwards, and was diagnosed with complex PTSD. So has now trained as a trauma therapist. So we're going to be talking a bit about trauma and the traumatic effects of COVID, but is now involved at UCL, where she's created a online program that's accredited and got a big evidence base behind it called Pocket Stress Buster. So we'll be hearing a bit about that as well. And finally, last but not least, is Luciana, who is the co-founder of a tech startup called MindCheck, that's been doing quite a lot of work over the last few months. She's done a big survey, which I'm going to be really interested to hear the results of, because lots of people have signed up during the coronavirus crisis. And so there's some really good evidence that she will share with us in a minute. She's got lived experience of mental health, has had COVID, as Victoria has as well, but is also a city ambassador for the European Digital Society, and working on a project at the moment about reintegration and resilience of kind of a pan-European collective response for developing scalable, replicable and adaptable mental health solutions for frontline health workers. So I've got some brilliant people here, and I'd like you all to sort of put in your chat and questions to them, and I'll bring them in. But I'm going to start with Jane, because as I said before in my introduction, you are an intensive nurse, or were an intensive care nurse. So can you share your experience? And I know you've been talking to others who've worked on the front line about what's sort of going on and what you think in how and what the reality is in the front line at the moment, please.
Okay, thanks, Amy, and lovely to be part of this panel today. I think that it's very challenging, Amy. I think that these are things that certainly I would have never been trained for, and I don't think many other staff would have been trained to deal with a lot of these situations. When you are nursing, yes, it's certainly in intensive care, you are dealing with an awful lot of an equipment, and you're dealing with people who are very sick and unwell. But I suppose what you do have is you do have that physical touch with them. You know, they can look at you, they can see you smiling. And I suppose for a lot of nurses, and certainly the nurses I've spoken to, that's been a very challenging part of what they've had to work through in this period of time. I think most nurses have gone through that stage of, you know, doing the barrier nursing and those sorts of things. But again, not actually having to wear PPE day in, day out. So there's a physical aspect of that for what you're looking at with the and psychological, what you're looking at for the patient. But then you've got the member of staff as well that's having to accommodate that type of uniform, which again they've not had to accommodate. I think one of the things that really struck me, which one of my colleagues, I've sort of got all my notes here, and one of them was telling me, and I don't know whether this is national or not, but certainly this was in a intensive care unit north of the UK. And basically, you know, she was saying what they found really hard is obviously having to tell people on the phone that their relative had died, or how ill or how sick their relative was. And in their particular hospital, they actually had a code that was given to the family. And obviously they wouldn't speak to anybody unless you actually had this code. And they just said that those types of things were just unprecedented. I mean, they were not things that they really had to manage previously. And I think another one was the fear factor. So, you know, the fear factor of what might happen to them, what might happen to their own families. And I don't think that matters whether you were in intensive care. I think that is about being out there on the front line generally, you know, that people are really having to, you know, manage and cope with those situations. And I was actually running a course this morning for a London council, and two of the staff there out of the 14 delegates had said that, again, because they were frontline staff working within the NHS, they've now developed agoraphobia, where they actually have a fear of actually leaving their own homes because of what they've actually seen and what they've gone through. So I think we, you know, in our title, isn't it, today, it is very much about, you know, recovery from the front lines. And I think that, you know, organisations are really going to have to look and see what it is that they do. So obviously with anybody's research, as we've got, you know, maybe from Luciana today and what Victoria has been doing as well, I think, you know, I really just hope that organisations will listen to the experts in this subject and really take on board and listen to what the people want, what those members of staff want. So one of my colleagues was saying to me, you know, I think I'd prefer a one-to-one session. And then in the next breath, she said to me, but maybe it would be quite good to have a session with everybody else to understand, you know, what it is they've gone through as well. So I think a lot of people just don't know. I think a lot of people really just don't know what it is they need and what it is they require.
Yeah, and thinking about it, when I was in my 20s and was running my online mental health company, I was working with a lot of police forces, and what we used to roll out there was TRIM, which was trauma management, which was a peer-to-peer trauma response to go through situations after with your colleagues and talk about them, and it was a sort of decompression. You repeated that 6 months later to see if you were coming down in terms of the scores. That I've seen that there's STRAW, which is a workplace version of TRIM. I'm going to ask Victoria, because you are our trauma expert. Do you think those sorts of peer-to-peer approaches as well as one-to-one will be what's needed?
Absolutely. I think it's complex because the perceived level of fear that someone feels will be partly predicted by their own personal history. And then what predicts that response is then also juggled like mathematics and probability behind the brain. So then it gets really, really complicated. So in one situation, your client can feel that she wants to talk about the problem with everyone. But then at another level, it will mean something else to her. So she suddenly won't want to talk about it to everyone, which is why the lady you were talking to earlier today, Jane, was conflicted, because it has so many different levels of meaning. So there's hierarchy of need that's established.
Yeah.
So community support, shared experience is a fantastic way to, as you say, in the trim method, to diffuse. And then after that, when the settling down process has kicked in, you tend to see the residual elements left, and that's when you get shades of PTSD kicking in. Everyone goes through trauma at the beginning. There's sleepless nights, there's nightmares, there's all the physical responses that you get in a more extreme response. But and I use this word very loosely, in healthy patients or in a normal situation, that tends to settle over a period of months or 6 weeks plus, depending on the level of the experience. And obviously circumstances and ongoing, etc. But if things start to niggle or come about afterwards, then it becomes much more personal. So then you need more one-to-one help to understand what is really going on behind the scenes. So that's an answer.
No, it was really interesting. And Lena, I mean, you obviously are a clinical psychologist as well, but work within organisations putting things in place. What sort of approaches do you think that organisations have put in place now?
I really think that I've seen increase in awareness, first and foremost, among leaders in general, and that what we have learned from the COVID-19, one of the many lessons is the importance of interpersonal skills and how important it will be in the future. So especially in the future with AI and emerging technologies, that I've seen workplaces, and especially within healthcare, these skills will be so important. So like compassion, empathy, trust, just ability to communicate and collaborate effectively, and so on. So the leaders, healthcare leaders, really need to embody these kind of skills, and we need to really select and reward leaders who can step up and really like promote or facilitate a culture based on trust and collaboration and support, instead of this competition culture that we have seen so much around, trying to compete all the time, compare yourself with others, and so on. So to really awareness is key. You can't really change either an organization, or you can't really change on individual level if you do not start with awareness. So that is always the first step. And then you also need to acknowledge the problems. It's not enough to just observe them, but acknowledge the importance of the issues and really listen to the people. We need leaders who can listen, and if leaders don't listen, people will just stop to talk. So inclusive leaders, and I think in Norway and in Scandinavia in general, we have this kind of flat leadership where there's a lot of inclusion and everyone is viewed as equal. And that really helps that has really helped a lot in the COVID-19 response as well. We actually have a Norwegian word called dugnad, which kind of means everyone joins together and contributes to the whole towards a common goal or aim, and you create something that is bigger than any one of the individual parts. And the spirit of dugnad has been very, very strong in Norway during the COVID-19 response. And when hospitals applied for or announced that they're searching for volunteers, enormous response, and they got so many. Everyone wants to contribute, And even we have had quite low cases in Norway. We have seen this kind of spirit towards collaboration, and that's really what's needed within
here in the UK in terms of how we responded as a country towards the NHS. I was chatting at the weekend to one of the mums at my daughter's school, who is an anaesthetist and has just spent the last 3 months, as her husband is, working in intensive care. And one of the things that struck me was she was saying that the response for each NHS organisation will depend on what their responses were before, because it's variable. And I've certainly worked in a lot of NHS trusts. Some trusts absolutely nailed, great strategies, really invested in it and did stuff. Others are a lot further behind on their journey. And I think for me, because my work is in strategies and structure, and the things you've mentioned about having awareness, having support, but actually the key, I think, going forward will make sure as an organisation that you have a really good structure of support and strategy with your sort of awareness and prevention all the way through to sort of Victoria's world of how you actually look after people, whether that's whether or not making sure that those are implemented. Luciana, I'm going to come to you because you've got some really interesting sort of hot off the press research that you've been doing over the last few months from the NHS. So what do you want to tell us about your survey and what it is that what you've been asking and what results you've seen?
Yeah, so the kind of the results that we got were very much hand in hand with what Jane, Victoria, and Lena were talking about, in the sense that it's sort of actually interestingly 44% of the respondents were accounted were nurses and nurse practitioners. So we saw quite a lot of people that within then a melting pot of different specialties, but primarily we're talking about a mix between public and private. And really, where I come from, we've got a digital health platform that looks at stress, anxiety, and depression. And what we wanted to try to identify is in which way we can help people with the awareness piece, where individuals can better understand their own levels of mental health and physical health pre-COVID and post-COVID, but also try to raise awareness in where do we go from here, right? As particularly as our responses to the pandemic was changing. So I can talk about a couple of things, in the sense that the majority were skewed quite young. So about 55% were between 20 to 30-year-olds. And in terms of general mental and physical health, we saw that they were on average twice poorer post-COVID than pre-COVID.
And these were nurse practitioners, yeah? So nurse practitioners from the NHS who were
exactly
a survey on your app. So they were twice as likely to be unwell after the COVID.
After the COVID, yeah. We had different specialties as well, but primarily nurse and nurse practitioners. We also saw that there was 66% reported their mental well-being being between 2 or 3 out of 5, whereas before it had been nearly 100 in terms of well-being. Also, interestingly, something that's been coming up in terms of the most common causes of anxiety, where this, what Jane touched upon, this fear of infection and going back and infecting families, or this sort of a general sense of unease over what to do kind of post, how to then adapt to their families. So not necessarily, we actually had respondents saying, I'm not actually afraid of getting it myself, but I would feel awful if I gave it to someone else, particularly my family. We also saw, I think, interestingly, in terms of quantitatively, but moving on to the qualitative data, what we saw was that things kept popping up it was very hard to switch off, in the sense that the coronavirus, pandemic is everywhere. So it's very difficult to relax after work, because everything reminds me of work. So there's no way to escape a mention of it. Also, particularly, which I found is interesting, is this dichotomy between we're increasingly isolated, therefore I want human connection and I want social connection, but how do you balance that with safe social distancing measures? And how can I ensure that I want to see my friends, but at the same time, I'm at a greater risk for infection, so I would not want to infect anyone. So it's there are a lot of interplays there and dilemmas. Also, as mentioned, lack of proper PPE, particularly lack of consistent, regular strategies between different workplaces, and also patients entering facilities without masks, presenting with COVID symptoms, but lying about symptoms beforehand when there was a call screening because they didn't want to miss the appointment, but then sort of the exacerbated fear that comes with that, and how to sort of manage not only themselves, but potential patients, COVID patients, the uncertainty sort of weighing on them.
Any of your respondents have solutions? Because I mean, it's really, really interesting hearing from you, what sort of comments people are making. And we know there's a problem, but were there any specific solutions that they suggested might work going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we wanted to understand is in what actionable ways are you coping with stress and with anxiety and with uncertainty? And what we found out, which was quite beautiful, there was a lot of time spent outdoors. And actually that goes that was very aligned with what we found in our platform, in sense of how the biggest contributing factor to stress and anxiety for not just healthcare workers, but the general population, was that disconnection from nature due to quarantine. So in terms of support and coping mechanisms, that was a lot of sports, spending time outdoors, being intensely organized, which is funny, given what we were just talking about as well.
Suggestions for organisations. So I'm thinking, if an organisation put together a good health and mental health strategy and looked at sort of the trim type stuff as well as part of that, maybe changes in shift patterns or extra time off afterwards or things like that. Were any
Exactly. What they were talking mostly about themselves as an individual. So just being intensely organized with their timekeeping, and trying to weave in time for self-care, which we know historically is quite difficult for healthcare workers. But particularly what we thought was interesting as a suggestion in one workplace was actually to come in and run from top down, so from leadership, 5 to 10 minute sessions around self-care strategies that, so in a sense, empower individuals to take more of that control over in whatever way they can, dedicate their time to understand what would better support them, and actually become aware of those the self-care strategies. But then also in those 5 to 10 minutes, they could better identify those that needed extra support. So like Victoria was saying, they could then go into more of a one-on-one approach. And there was a lot, I think it was quite hopeful. We had some testimonials of, I am better than I was. The increased sanitation and screenings have become a new normal. So sort of is that human tendency to adapt. We're quite adaptable beings and resilient beings. So in the moment that are psychologically, this is a new normal, and we're able to sort of, and especially before there was a lot of hearsay and unknowns in relation to the crisis. So
the NHS is anything so adaptable. I mean, the NHS
exactly
for years has been adapting to lower and lower salaries and budgets. It's a very resourceful workforce of people who've been sort of, not surviving, but that's the wrong word, but kind of they're very adaptable and resourceful. But it's how we then make sure and how we make sure that we're not completely grinding people.
Yeah, I'd like to just mention that there was papers, I can link to it in the chat. It was from Stanford, but from early April, that talked about understanding and addressing the sources of anxiety. So they identified, we've touched upon the majority of them, but 8 common causes of anxiety for frontline workers, and then how to address them. They actually have a framework of, I don't know if you've come across it before, but it says, hear me, protect me, prepare me, support me, and care for me. And exactly how that translates into what leadership can do. So I thought that was a really interesting resource to share with the audience.
The challenge will be, from my experience of working, a lot of work as an NHS consultant, thanks for the chat, is how we translate all of these things that we need to do. The speaker, Lena's point about leadership, into action that's going to reach my life, as opposed to being yet another value statement that's into the notice board of the trap. And that actually, you know, we were talking, I was doing before in an earlier session about somebody who was saying the reality of having lunch was being asked to find disco summaries, how actually we can make sure that people can attend those 5 to 10 minutes, and how HR policy reflects, you know, people being able to weave health and mental health and being looked after into their year end and what they're measured on. Yeah, you do a lot of work with organisations. Have you worked with a lot of NHS trusts in this way in actually putting in things to support staff?
Sorry, Amy, I didn't grasp who you were asking the question to.
Yeah.
Me. I think, hang on a minute. Well, I was just smiling then when Luciana was talking through some of her things and some of the strategies they had in place. And my colleague who works in the hospital north of the country, they've created what they call a wobble room for staff. And staff go, if they think they're going to have a wobble, then they can go in there. And it's very interesting what you were talking about leadership, what you were saying. I've had very mixed messages from the people I've spoken to. You know, the lady north of the country, they have said that they haven't experienced an awful lot of management support. I think in the 4 months that they've been in intensive care, twice a manager put on full PPE and came in to actually see them. And then I've got another colleague who actually is a community midwife who's had to go on shielding because she has type 1 diabetes. And she said they've been absolutely fantastic. You know, they've created a job for her and been very, very supportive. So I think, unfortunately, I think we're going to see a mixture of what people assume as being supportive or not being supportive. And I was likening it back, Amy, it was quite interesting. Again, I was chatting to some colleagues about this the other day. And certainly when I worked in cardiology, you know, when somebody had a cardiac event, you know, that fear factor would kick in. And they'd say they'd do anything, you know, to try and, you know, make sure that they didn't have another cardiac event. 6 weeks later, when you saw them in cardiac rehab, they'd forgotten about that. And I think what you've just said is so important, Amy, because I think organisations, NHS organisations, they really must have a strategy, because I think they'll get involved with some of the other things that maybe, you know, their targets with cancer and with surgery and all the other things that have been put on the back burner at this moment in time. And I think they'll go back to the norm. And the problem is for these people who've been through as frontline workers in the NHS, you know, they have been through, as Victoria was saying, trauma, and trauma manifests itself in so many different ways. So, you know, for me, I think that, you know, organisations have got to sit down, as I said in my earlier conversation, you know, they've got to sit down with the experts. And I mean people who really know what they're talking about. You know, somebody, again, like yourself, Amy, where you've worked with organisations and you've put strategies in place. With research, as we've already talked about here. And instead of actually thinking this is what we should be doing, let's speak to the staff, but let's speak also to the people and those experts who can hopefully give really good evidence-based researched advice for these organisations. I think already, I mean, I know you and Amy have already had this conversation, you know, about organisations that currently seem to want to put the tick box in, you know, where they just want to tick the box and we're off. And I really think that they're going to see a huge increase in sickness absence and anxiety and depression if they just do that particular approach.
The reality is I was going to ask you, but I was about to say, a lot of people haven't been attending the NHS. They've been too worried because of coronavirus, and a lot of operations, and I've got a friend who's it's been put back. So you've got people who've been working flat out for 3 months who are then going to not be any less busy because they'll be catching up. When wave comes, then that's even worse. Victoria, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to ask you.
No, it's all right. There's 2 things to say, but one thing I wanted to say before the conversation went on to the next theme is that for the corporates, as you say, some of it is tick boxy, and I think they'll be scared by the talk of all this change, structural changes, HRs, when they've got to meet their demands. But one thing that I don't think corporates realise, and also individuals, is that self-care starts with 1 minute to yourself. And just throughout the day, it doesn't, if the person was to set a timer once an hour, once every 2 hours, whatever it be, to go off and do progressive muscle relaxation, breathing, just follow their breathing for 1 minute throughout the day, they're already giving their body quite a lot of help. Just enjoying that cup of tea for 30 seconds longer, for going, hold on, I'm really drinking this cup of tea. It makes a huge difference So if you can do really, really tiny things within structures, group structures, to make it very personal and effective as a new strategy. And this is what also people, both the experience, the sufferer, the patient, the employee, goes through, but also management. They don't need to be scared like they have been traditionally of mental health, which was slowly getting down, but also physical health and the numbers. I mean, I used to work in corporate. I'm happy with that world, so it's not a problem. But I think that's also something that really needs to be examined, and maybe it takes talking to a professional to realize this, is that it doesn't have to be let's organize a whole new gym program for our staff and where we're going to fit in 3-hour sessions during the day.
It's having 5 minutes once you've left the shift, calm down.
Yeah. And the other thing is what Lena pointed on, is that you can give them little tiny self-care tips, which are like these 1-minute things, breathing and muscle, but also classic tips on how to express yourself. Like, that makes me feel, like really simple sentences that enable someone to be able to verbalize, and when to verbalize at the first point in a way that's non-threatening for the person who dares to say it, and for the listener who's got to listen to something which they may instantly feel that their back's up. So there's all sorts of things that you can do that are really small, like small nudges, but quite big effects if they're employed and rolled out.
Yeah, right, very much. But also, I mean, my sort of work is how you then bring those into the workplace and make sure that they're done. Because a lot of the I think one of the other systems I was listening to earlier was saying that one of the things at the start of the crisis is that there was so many things being offered that was slightly overwhelming in itself, and that's my experience, which is why I always start with strategy. And that there's so many great things out there now, and things you can do both from leadership, management, as an individual, self-care, but it's how do you then implement them in an organisation to make sure they do become part of business as usual, and that's what people are doing. Whether that's giving doctors and nurses a 5-minute windows to sort of decompress on their way out of the shift. I was interested, someone talked about a wobble room. Lena, you know the answer to this. Is having a wobble room, and being able to take time out, does that make a big difference overall on the sort of on a stressful situation turning into trauma or long-term PTSD? Those sorts of approaches, because they're quite quick and easy to implement, is what I'm thinking. So if they have a big outcome on the end, that's a good thing. Have you seen those sorts of approaches? Yeah. Yes, go. Yes, you go.
Did you ask me? Victoria, just please. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I think it can make a really big difference. It's all about having time for yourself and just have the balance to just be able to set your boundaries, also communicate your boundaries. Some are so afraid to just practice healthy self-assertiveness, just say no or set boundaries. So that's really important to just be able to allowing ourselves this space to just be, and like they have mentioned, practice relaxation techniques and do some meditation and so on. So I think it's very key that you have the self-care opportunity within the workplace, but also in your spare time, that you're consistent also with. It's all about the regular routines, that you really implement them during your day and try to really stick to them to see what kind of difference it makes.
You see a lot of these things where actually you are looked down on if you then go and use the room that's been set. And I think also making sure that these things are around a long time, because what you see in lots of very intense periods, and I think, Jane, you alluded to this, is that actually everyone will do things for the next 2 weeks, but it's how you make sure staff, especially if there is a second wave or there's a huge backlog of other patients, that they're actually able to use these things and that they're around for a long time. I mean, that was why I looked at it wasn't just the one-shot sort of thing. Victoria, have you seen sort of incidences like kind of the timeout and the wobble rooms having an impact long-term on trauma?
Yeah, because it touches back on the first comment that I mentioned, which is if you can express if you can express yourself early on, and just the energy and emotion, feelings, it's just energy in the body. Literally, you could see it. It's energy that rises and it needs to be dispelled. If it can't be dispelled, it turns into stress and tension and headaches. So it's your body's call as a response to, oh, there's something going on in my environment here. What do I do with it? How do I direct myself? Do I turn it into running? Do I food? What do I do with it? So if you can dispel the energy as soon as it comes up, it doesn't back up and turn into a big explosion or an internalization down the line. So yeah, a wobble room, like the kitchen, you know, when you used to go in like the water dispenser in the kitchen, or where everyone goes and smokes a fag outside, those are wobble rooms, just unofficially wobble rooms. And so those places are great to dispel and share that initial trauma. And then as we mentioned at the beginning, if people are struggling to process that experience, it will pop up a little bit, it will lurk, and then but you'll be able to see that, you'll know that either the person themselves will notice it, or the colleagues around it will say, oh, they're struggling a bit. They'll start having a much more physical response.
Yeah, I think on that note, it's really important to educate people on there's no physical and mental health. It's just health. I mean, we come at it in a very holistic way, and it's still, you know, in the same way that mental health has been tabooed, we still have such discrepancy in organizations on how HR approaches physical health versus mental health. So actually being able to have more of that dialogue around the holisticness of health, I think it's really crucial.
Yeah. I think it was interesting that Victoria, just very, very simple things that started to have an impact on her life and a colleague's life. And one of the things she said to me is that at some point I thought, I don't want to go back into that situation again tomorrow. And another phrase she said to me that a colleague said to her is, I didn't sign up for this. And the other thing that they were noticing is that, you know, when the shift is finished, and I mean, they work 14-hour shifts in this gear. And what she said is, of course, you know, you've got to shower, you've got to wash your hair, you know, it's just the little practical things that probably we don't think about, that suddenly just I suppose intrude on that space that they feel is their time, things that, you know, that they feel their time suddenly seems to be absorbed wholly by this COVID-19, you know, being able to just finish that shift. And then, as you were saying, Luciana, you know, I was noting down some of, you know, what you were saying about your statistics, you know, this fear of infection, you know, and so I think when all of that accumulates, it explodes, doesn't it? And what you're saying, Victoria, and the things that we advise, you know, on our training courses is, you know, take those things moment by moment and do something today to deal with it. We're very good at saying, I'll deal with it tomorrow. I'll deal with that when I've got a strategy. I'll deal with it when somebody else gives me something, you know, better that I can be doing. And then by the time you do deal with it, of course, it's huge, and it's escalated then into so many aspects of your life. So I think for me, it's you know, deal with it, do something today that just helps you. I talk about recovery with people, as you were saying, Luciana, you know, the whole holistic approach. How do we get back down to that recovery level? Because we've all got to get there. Because if we don't, we're going to go up into stress, and in the end we are looking at either physical or mental, you know, ill health. So I think for me, it's always think about what just a little thing that I could be doing today to just get back down to that, you know, that recovery level. And you've mentioned loads of things, Victoria, obviously, that people can be doing, and then they don't cost anything. Do you know what I mean?
Just what can I be doing for myself? It's what can I be doing for my team and my co-workers and the people.
Absolutely.
I'm a leadership position. It's that. Victoria, go.
No, I was just to say, in following to Jane's comment about wash down things, so this is more particular to me to say the COVID thing, but then use nice soaps. Enjoy the experience of washing down. Make this your time, like bath time becomes your time, your checking out time. That's the day behind. Physically feel the experience and nice smooth soaps and get a nicer body lotion. So a corporate could give out nicer soaps. It becomes a nicer thing. It sounds nuts, but I bought nice gloves early on because I thought, Christ, if we're all going to have to go around, you know, using plastic gloves all the time, that's not right. Why don't I make going out more of a fashion thing for me? So I went off.
My daughter and I have matching face masks.
Yeah, well, that's the whole matching thing, isn't it? But I mean, it is, and like when you do lunch, just I know you may just for the moment, and it's harder when you haven't got a lunch break. But you go, actually, you know what? Today I'm just going to have a nicer meal. Like the self-care routines has to become a little bit more personalized again, and they're small things, but it's the bite size.
Yeah, Rob said something that I had never thought about right at the start of the conference, which just really hit me. You know, the social distancing term. You know, and I think it was you, Luciana, who talked about having to be physically distanced from people. But that's not being socially distanced. And I think if you're coming off a shift, it must be very difficult because you have to physically wash yourself. But your interactions with your family or children, you might be a bit concerned about that. That must be very traumatic building up. But it's how you can keep that social aspect even whilst physically distanced.
Yeah, completely. We had that in the actionable ways that workers are dealing with uncertainty and stress. We had a few comments around limiting the amount of time I let myself talk about work around family and friends, but also FaceTiming relatives because trips were canceled and because we can't leave the house. But sort of ensuring that you are not socially distanced, you're physically distanced, but we're using all these incredible technology platforms to keep that connection alive.
And also change that connection, because sometimes our eyes get tired of the screen. Some people are really struggling with long days in front of the screens, and then they don't want to do FaceTime with their friends. So change to audio. That just to give you to give yourself a little bit of a break. And I don't know whether I can say this, so I hope it's not deemed out of line. But if you're in the PPP and you're all dressed up, maybe fellow PPP people dressed up can pat each other on the shoulder, because if they're going to go and wash down afterwards, can you do that? Because would that be helpful? Because you're both protected.
I don't know the answer to that.
That's why screams of horror from anyone who's listening.
I don't know. I would assume not, but maybe it is okay. Maybe somebody on the maybe somebody in our participants today could actually answer that question for us. Do pop it on the chat. Let us know. Again, it may be that it's very different from organisation to organisation. Do you know what I mean? What processes and policies and procedures they put in place around that. So I think I think that would vary depending on where you work and what they've decided to put in place, basically.
And also the lessons learned. I think we're often very quick to move from one thing to the next or to forget about it. So I would, as well as building in a kind of proper mental health policy to look after staff and ensuring that's there, the lessons learned from this, so that hopefully, this never happens again. But if it does, we know how to support people better earlier on. Because I think when this crisis started, it was such a shock to everybody that we weren't, we talked about being prepared for a global pandemic, but, I think we weren't really, so in terms of preparation of organisations, in terms of processes, but also in terms of how we then build in to people with proper health and mental health support. Not that I'm saying we haven't, but to make it a core part further on, because I think we were all sort of muddling around at the beginning, sort of just in sort of panicking. So if you've got that built into your planning strategies and for next time as to what we can do to keep it, do we put the wobble rooms in? Do we make sure there's trim? Have we got mental health first aiders? I saw Fanula when I looked through. Fanula's on today, but mental health first aid, great tool to roll out for people talking to each other. So are our organisations, able to talk? Have we got those strategies in place? Do managers know what they need to do? Are leaders role modelling the right behaviour so that next time if something like this happens, we'll be doing it anyway, but we are better prepared for it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because I think in reality, I always knew when we had a really, really bad shift, a late shift or whatever, and people say, "Oh, let's just go to the social club. Let's just go and have a drink," and you have a bit of a laugh, and humour comes back in again. And this is one of the other things that my colleagues were saying to me, is that it's things like that they really miss because they're not doing any of that anymore. So. It is really hard at times for them to be looking at that. How do we get that social contact back? Which I think a lot of them are really, sort of waiting for that to happen.
Yeah. Fantastic, everyone. Thank you so much. That was, I could listen to this for much longer. And I know you could talk for much longer, but some really great perspectives. And I love that simplicity of Victoria. Self-care can take a minute a day. And I think we can all do that, can't we? And taking away that. And Luciano, I love the link that you shared, and understanding what people want in terms of how to look after us. So really good stuff. Thank you all so much for joining us, and Amy, great job in the chair. Brilliant.